"You're too old to sit with us," my daughter-in-law whispered with a smile at the family reunion, loud enough for the entire table to hear. My son lowered his eyes and kept cutting his steak like nothing had happened. I stood there for a second holding the peach cobbler I had spent all morning baking, still warm beneath the dish towel wrapped around the pan. The dining room suddenly felt too bright, too crowded, too small for the humiliation rising quietly inside my chest.
I'm Evelyn Carter.
I turned 70 last spring, and until that evening, I truly believed family embarrassment only happened in movies or stories online. I arrived at the reunion 30 minutes early because that was how my late husband always liked things done. Robert used to say showing up early was a sign of respect. The reunion was held at my son Daniel's house outside Denver. A large 2-story home with white columns and expensive patio furniture Monica constantly posted online. Cars already lined the driveway when I pulled up. I remember smoothing my blue cardigan before stepping out of my Buick, carrying the cobbler carefully in both hands because Sophie had asked me the week before if I would bring Grandma's famous dessert. For a moment, hearing that had made me feel needed again. Inside the house, laughter echoed through the dining room. Monica's sisters were opening wine bottles while country music played softly from a speaker near the kitchen island. My grandchildren ran through the hallway wearing matching reunion t-shirts Monica had designed. Everyone looked coordinated except me. No one had told me there was a dress theme. Monica noticed me first. Her smile tightened for half a second before she walked over and air-kissed my cheek. "Oh good, you made it," she said. Made it? As if I had been optional. I handed her the cobbler and asked where she wanted me to sit. That was when her eyes flicked toward the dining table. My chair was gone. 12 seats filled the long oak table beneath the hanging chandelier. But the small name card that used to say Evelyn had disappeared. In its place sat a flower arrangement shaped like a pumpkin. "We thought you'd be more comfortable over there," Monica said casually, pointing toward a tiny folding table near the sliding glass doors beside the kitchen trash bin. 2 children sat there coloring on paper placemats. I stared at the table, then back at her. Before I could answer, she leaned closer and gave a soft laugh. "You're too old to sit with us anyway." Someone nearby chuckled nervously. I looked at Daniel. My son, the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the backyard and cry whenever I left him at school. He heard every word. I know he did. But instead of speaking, he reached for his water glass and avoided my eyes completely. Something cold settled inside me then. Not anger. Not even sadness. Just clarity. The kind that arrives quietly after years of making excuses for people who stopped loving you properly a long time ago. I walked to the small folding table and sat down beside my 6-year-old grandson while the rest of my family laughed beneath the chandelier Robert helped me choose 22 years earlier. And as I sat there listening to forks clink against expensive china, I realized this was not the first time Monica had tried to erase me from the family. It was simply the first time she had stopped pretending not to. I stayed at the folding table for nearly 2 hours that night. Nobody asked if I was comfortable. Nobody offered to switch seats with me. The children beside me lost interest in coloring after dinner and disappeared upstairs to play video games, leaving me alone near the kitchen while the adults poured coffee and shared stories at the main table beneath the chandelier. Every now and then I caught fragments of conversation drifting across the room. Vacation plans. Home renovations. Monica talking about replacing the kitchen countertops with imported marble. Daniel laughing louder than usual whenever her brothers made jokes. It amazed me how easy it had become for him to perform happiness while pretending not to notice his own mother sitting 10 feet away like an afterthought. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap and smiled whenever someone glanced in my direction. Years ago, I would have made excuses for all of it. I would have told myself everyone was busy. That family's changed. That younger people had different priorities now. But sitting there beside the trash bin while someone else occupied my place at the table Robert and I once hosted Christmas dinners around, something inside me finally stopped defending them. On the drive home, snow began falling lightly across the highway. The windshield wipers moved back and forth in slow rhythm while old country music played softly through the speakers. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter when a memory suddenly came back to me. 3 years earlier, just 2 months after Robert passed away, I had invited Daniel and Monica over for Sunday dinner. I cooked pot roast with carrots and fresh biscuits because it had always been Daniel's favorite meal growing up. I spent nearly 6 hours cleaning the house beforehand even though nobody besides family was coming. Back then I still believed if I tried hard enough, things would feel normal again. They arrived 40 minutes late. Monica walked in carrying her phone instead of offering to help with dinner. Daniel barely hugged me before sitting down on the couch to answer work emails. During dinner, Monica spent most of the evening talking about a couple's trip they were planning to Napa Valley. At one point I asked if Sophie could spend a weekend with me during summer break like she used to. Monica smiled without looking up from her wine glass. "We are trying to avoid too much disruption in her routine," she said politely. Routine. As though I was something inconvenient that needed to be managed carefully. After dessert, Daniel pulled me aside near the laundry room. He would not meet my eyes then either. He explained they were going to spend Thanksgiving with Monica's family that year because it was simpler. Simpler. That word stayed with me for weeks afterward. Somehow my side of the family had slowly become complicated while Monica's became essential. Little by little, I stopped being included in photographs, vacations, birthdays, and decisions. Sometimes Monica would forget to tell me about school recitals until afterward. Sometimes I found out about family gatherings through social media posts from relatives. Every incident by itself looked harmless, small enough to dismiss, but together they formed something colder, something intentional. When I finally pulled into my driveway after the reunion, my porch light glowed against the falling snow exactly the way Robert used to leave it for me whenever I worked late hospital shifts. I sat in the car for a long moment staring at the empty front porch. The silence around me felt familiar now, almost practiced. Then I looked down and realized I still had my paper name card folded inside my purse. Someone had tossed it there when they cleared the table. The edges were bent. My name barely visible beneath a wine stain. The next morning I woke up at 5:30 out of habit, even though I had retired from nursing almost 8 years earlier. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the old clock above the stove ticking steadily through the darkness. I stood at the kitchen counter in my robe making coffee for one, the same way I had every morning since Robert died. Some mornings the silence still startled me. Other mornings it felt like another piece of furniture I had learned to live beside. Snow covered the backyard overnight, leaving the maple trees behind the fence dusted white beneath the pale Colorado sunrise. Robert used to shovel the walkway before I even woke up. He always said he liked the cold air because it made him feel useful. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and caught myself smiling at the memory before the sadness settled back in quietly behind it. Around 7 o'clock my phone buzzed with a family group notification. Monica had posted photos from the reunion the night before. In every picture she stood at the center smiling brightly with one manicured hand resting on Daniel's arm, while everyone crowded around the long dining table beneath the chandelier. Sophie appeared in several photos laughing beside her cousins. Even the peach cobbler made it into one picture. But I was nowhere. Not a single photograph showed me sitting at the folding table near the kitchen. Not one picture showed the woman who baked the dessert, brought homemade cranberry bread, and drove 70 miles through snowfall just to spend time with her family. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Then I noticed the caption Monica wrote beneath the photos. "Perfect night with the people who matter most." I do not know why that sentence hurt more than the chair or the whispers or even Daniel refusing to defend me. Maybe because it confirmed what I had slowly feared for years. I was no longer included in the definition of family. Around noon Sophie called unexpectedly. Her voice sounded hesitant, softer than usual. "Grandma, did you get home okay?" she asked. I told her I had. There was a pause before she spoke again. "I did not like what happened yesterday." I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. Sophie had always been careful with her words, even as a little girl. When she was 6, she used to hide behind my legs whenever Monica scolded her too sharply at birthday parties. "Your mother was probably stressed hosting everyone," I replied automatically, still protecting Monica out of instinct more than belief. Sophie sighed quietly. "Mom says you get too emotional at family events and make people uncomfortable." The words landed heavily between us. I looked out the window at the snow beginning to melt along the driveway. Emotional. That had become Monica's favorite word for me over the years. Emotional when I cried after Robert's funeral. Emotional when I asked why nobody visited anymore. Emotional when I noticed I had stopped being invited to vacations and birthdays. It was a convenient word because once someone labeled you emotional, they no longer had to listen to anything you said afterward. Sophie lowered her voice. Grandma, I heard Mom and Dad talking after everyone left. My grip tightened around the phone. Talking about what? Another pause. Then very quietly she said, about the cabin by Lake Granby. My heart skipped once. Robert built that cabin himself nearly 30 years ago with cedar wood and his own hands. Every summer of Daniel's childhood lived inside those walls. Fishing poles by the fireplace. Family photographs in the hallway. Sophie taking her first canoe ride at age 8. What about it? I asked carefully. Sophie hesitated again. Mom said once they sell it, things will finally get easier. I did not sleep much after that phone call. I lay awake staring at the ceiling while snowmelt tapped softly against the gutters outside my bedroom window. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the cabin. Robert standing on the unfinished porch with sawdust on his jeans. Daniel at 12 years old running toward the lake carrying a fishing rod almost taller than he was. Sophie asleep beside the fireplace wrapped in a blanket decorated with little pine trees. Some places hold memories so deeply that losing them feels like losing people all over again. By morning, the knot in my chest had settled into something steadier. Not panic. Awareness. Around 10 o'clock I drove into town for groceries, though truthfully I mostly needed to get out of the house. The local market near Main Street had already started putting out Christmas decorations, even though Thanksgiving was still weeks away. Artificial wreaths hung above aisles filled with cinnamon candles and peppermint candy displays. I pushed my cart slowly through the produce section when I heard someone call my name. Evelyn Carter? I turned and found myself face to face with Laura Bennett, one of Robert's oldest friends from the architecture firm where they worked together decades ago. Laura looked older than the last time I saw her, silver hair tucked neatly beneath a wool hat, but her smile remained warm and familiar. We stood near the apples talking for nearly 20 minutes. Mostly small things at first. Weather. Retirement. Her grandchildren in Arizona. Then her expression shifted gently. I heard about the reunion, she said quietly. My stomach tightened. I must have looked surprised because she touched my arm softly. Monica's cousin attends my church. Of course she did. Small towns carry stories quickly. I gave a faint smile and told her it was nothing important. Laura studied me for a moment with the kind of look only women our age understand. A look that says I know you are pretending to be stronger than you feel. Robert worried about you before he passed, she said carefully. Not because you were weak. Because you trusted people too much. The words followed me long after I left the market. Back home, I carried the groceries inside and stood quietly in the kitchen staring at the old wooden recipe box beside the stove. Robert made it for me during our first year of marriage. The corners were uneven because he had never been good with small details, but he spent an entire weekend sanding and staining it anyway because he knew I loved recipe cards from my mother. I opened the box absent-mindedly and found one of Robert's handwritten notes tucked between the dividers. His handwriting slanted slightly to the right. For Evie. The cabin belongs to your heart as much as mine. I sat down immediately. My hands suddenly felt cold. I had forgotten about that note entirely. Robert used to leave little messages everywhere. Inside books, coat pockets, kitchen drawers. During our 43 years together, he filled ordinary spaces with reminders that I mattered. The sharpest pain of all was realizing how invisible I had become since losing the one person who always made me feel seen. That evening Daniel finally called. His voice sounded distracted, rushed. Hey Mom, just checking in. Not I am sorry. Not are you okay after what happened. Just checking in. I asked him directly whether he and Monica planned to sell the cabin. Silence stretched briefly on the line before he answered. We are just discussing options. It is expensive to maintain. I looked around my quiet kitchen while his words settled heavily between us. Expensive. That was the same word Monica once used about Robert's funeral flowers. The same word she used when Daniel suggested helping me replace my old water heater last winter. Somehow anything tied to me eventually became too expensive, too emotional, too complicated. Your father built that cabin himself, I said softly. Daniel sighed the way tired people do when they think someone older is being unreasonable. Mom, Nobody even uses it anymore. I closed my eyes then because suddenly I understood something terrible. They were not only trying to remove my seat from the table. Little by little, they were trying to erase every place where I had ever belonged. 3 days later I drove to the cabin alone. I did not tell Daniel where I was going because lately every conversation with him left me feeling smaller than before. The road to Lake Granby curved through pine trees dusted with early snow, the mountains rising blue and quiet beneath a gray November sky. Robert loved this drive. He used to roll the windows down even in cold weather because he said the air smelled cleaner near the lake. As I turned onto the gravel road leading to the cabin, memories came back so vividly it almost hurt to breathe. Daniel learning to ride a bicycle beside the dock. Sophie catching her first trout and screaming so loudly birds scattered from the trees. Robert sitting on the porch at sunset with a coffee mug warming his hands. For years this place had been the center of our family. Not because it was expensive. Not because it was large. Because it was where we loved one another best. The cabin looked exactly the same from the outside. Dark cedar siding. Green shutters. Wind chimes Robert bought during a summer trip to Wyoming hanging beside the front porch. But inside, something felt different immediately. Several framed family photographs were missing from the walls. The knitted blanket I kept folded over the couch had disappeared. Even the old ceramic lamp Robert's mother gave us was gone from the side table near the fireplace. I stood silently in the living room trying to understand what I was seeing, when I noticed a stack of papers sitting neatly on the kitchen counter. Real estate brochures. My stomach tightened. Luxury mountain property specialists. Exclusive Colorado lakefront listings. One brochure showed a smiling older couple walking along a beach beneath the words, "Simplify your retirement." I sat down slowly at the kitchen table while cold fear crept quietly through my chest. Monica had already started preparing to sell the cabin. She had not even waited until I agreed. My eyes drifted toward the hallway where small pencil marks still lined the wall measuring Sophie's height every summer since she was 6 years old. Robert refused to paint over them even after Monica complained they looked messy. "That wall tells our story," he used to say. I pressed my fingers lightly against the tallest mark with Sophie's name written beside it in faded black ink. 17 years old. Last summer she barely came to the cabin at all. Monica always had another camp, another activity, another reason to keep her busy elsewhere. The sound of tires crunching outside startled me. A moment later the front door opened and Sophie stepped inside carrying a paper bag from the bakery in town. She froze when she saw me standing there. "Grandma," she said softly. I tried to smile. I needed some air. Sophie looked down at the brochure still spread across the kitchen counter, and her face changed immediately. Not surprise. Guilt. "Mom and Dad were here last weekend," she admitted quietly. "They met with a realtor." I felt something sink heavily inside me, though by then I already knew the answer before asking the question. "Did they tell you why?" Sophie hesitated before setting the bakery bag on the counter. "Mom said the cabin is wasted on memories." Wasted on memories. I repeated the sentence silently in my head while staring at the lake through the kitchen window. Outside, snowflakes drifted slowly across the frozen shoreline Robert loved more than any place on earth. Sophie walked closer carefully, like someone approaching a wounded animal. "Grandma, I do not think they realize how cruel they sound sometimes." I looked at my granddaughter then, and for the first time in weeks I saw genuine sadness reflected back at me instead of discomfort or avoidance. Sophie reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small brass key attached to a faded leather tag. "Grandpa gave me this before he died," she whispered. "He told me if anything ever felt wrong about the cabin, I should make sure you open the old storage room downstairs." Sophie led me downstairs carrying a flashlight from the kitchen drawer because the basement light still flickered the way it always had. Robert used to promise every summer that he would finally rewire it properly, then laugh and say the cabin needed at least one thing imperfect to keep it humble. The narrow wooden steps creaked softly beneath our feet as we descended into the cool darkness below the cabin. The storage room sat behind an old pine door near the furnace, mostly forgotten over the years except during holidays when I searched for decorations or extra blankets. Sophie handed me the brass key silently. My fingers trembled slightly as I slid it into the lock. For a moment nothing happened. Then the mechanism clicked open with a dull metallic sound that echoed faintly through the basement. Inside, dust covered nearly everything. Shelves lined with old fishing gear, paint cans, camping lanterns, and cardboard boxes stacked carefully against the wall. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. Sophie aimed the flashlight toward a small wooden chest sitting beneath the workbench in the corner. My breath caught immediately because I recognized it. Robert built that chest during the winter Daniel turned 16. He used leftover cedar from the porch renovation and carved our initials into the lid with his pocket knife. I knelt slowly beside it, brushing dust from the top with my sleeve. The lid opened stiffly. Inside rested folders, envelopes, and several leather-bound notebooks tied neatly with twine. On top sat a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Robert's handwriting. For Evelyn. Only if things become difficult. I stared at the envelope for several seconds before carefully opening it. Sophie remained quiet beside me while I unfolded the letter inside. My sweet Evie, if you are reading this, then something inside our family has shifted in ways I hoped would never happen. I know you. You will make excuses for cruelty long after others stop deserving your kindness. That is why I prepared everything carefully. Beneath the letter sat legal documents bearing Robert's signature, along with the letterhead of his attorney, Charles Whitmore. My eyes moved slowly across the pages while confusion gave way to disbelief. Years before his death, Robert had placed the cabin and several family investments into a protected trust. But the conditions attached to it were unlike anything I expected. The trust could not be altered, sold, or transferred if I was being intentionally isolated, displaced, or pressured out of family decisions regarding the property. In that event, control of the assets would freeze immediately until reviewed personally by the trustee named in the documents. Charles Whitmore, Robert's attorney and closest friend from college. I sat back against the concrete wall trying to steady my breathing. Robert knew. Somehow he had seen the possibility long before I allowed myself to admit it. Sophie crouched beside me quietly. Grandpa used to say you saw the good in people even when they stopped showing it, she whispered. I looked down at another document inside the chest. Attached to it was a handwritten note from Robert dated 6 months before he passed away. Monica keeps asking Daniel about restructuring the cabin ownership. He thinks it is financial planning. I think it is something colder. Protect your heart, Evie. The tears came then, but not loudly. They slipped down silently while I sat surrounded by decades of memories buried beneath the cabin floor. Not because of the money or the property. Because Robert had spent his final months trying to protect me from loneliness he knew was coming. Upstairs, wind rattled softly against the cabin windows while evening shadows stretched across the basement floor. Sophie reached over and squeezed my hand gently. Grandma, she said carefully, I do not think Grandpa wanted you to stay quiet anymore. The following Sunday Monica hosted another family dinner. She called it a pre-holiday gathering, though everyone understood it was simply another excuse for appearances and photographs. This time I arrived exactly on time instead of early. I wore the cream-colored sweater Robert bought me during our last anniversary trip to Vermont and carried nothing in my hands.
No cobbler. No homemade bread.
No carefully wrapped gifts for the children. For the first time in years, I stopped trying to earn a place in a family that had already decided where I belonged. The moment I walked inside, Monica's eyes flicked briefly toward my empty hands before her polished smile returned. Evelyn, she said brightly, air-kissing my cheek again. We were wondering if you were bringing dessert. I smiled softly. I thought simplicity might make things easier for everyone. For half a second, confusion crossed her face before she laughed lightly as though I had made a harmless joke. The dining room looked almost identical to the reunion from weeks earlier. Same chandelier. Same polished silverware. Same carefully folded napkins beside expensive china plates Monica only used when guests visited. But this time, something had shifted quietly beneath the surface. I noticed it immediately. Sophie was watching her mother differently now. Not with fear exactly. More with disappointment. Daniel looked tired too. The deep lines near his eyes more visible than before. Monica, however, remained perfectly composed. People like Monica rarely believed consequences applied to them until the exact moment they arrived. As everyone settled toward the dining room, I noticed the seating arrangement immediately. Once again my name card sat alone at the small side table near the kitchen. Only this time there was no attempt to disguise it. Monica caught me looking and gave a tiny shrug. We thought you liked the quieter spot last time, she said casually. Before I could answer, Sophie crossed the room. Without saying a word, she picked up her own name card from the main table and carried it directly to the folding table beside mine. The room went strangely silent. Monica blinked. Sophie, sweetheart, your seat is over here. Sophie sat down calmly beside me and unfolded her napkin across her lap. I know, she replied quietly. But Grandma should not have to sit alone. Nobody spoke for several seconds. I glanced toward Daniel, expecting him to smooth things over the way he always did. Instead, he stared at his water glass with the same uncomfortable silence he had worn for years. Monica laughed softly, though tension sharpened the edges of her voice now. You are being dramatic. Sophie looked directly at her mother then. No, she said gently. I think we have all been pretending not to notice something for a very long time. The air in the dining room changed after that. Conversations became strained. Silverware clinked too loudly against plates. Monica smiled often, but her jaw tightened every time Sophie spoke to me warmly or asked about the cabin. Once I caught Monica watching us with something colder than irritation. Calculation. Halfway through dinner, Daniel finally cleared his throat awkwardly. Mom, he began carefully. Monica and I wanted to discuss the property taxes on the cabin. There it was. Straight to business. Straight to ownership. Straight to removing another piece of Robert from my life. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate before answering. That is interesting, I said calmly. Because tomorrow morning I have a meeting with Charles Whitmore regarding the trust your father established before he passed away. The silence afterward felt enormous. Daniel's face drained of color instantly. Monica stopped moving entirely. Across the table, Sophie lowered her eyes quietly into her lap while the chandelier light reflected sharply against untouched wine glasses. For the first time in years, nobody at that table looked at me like I was invisible anymore. The next morning, Denver woke beneath a pale gray sky heavy with snow clouds. I arrived at Charles Whitmore's office 10 minutes early, carrying the leather folder from the cabin pressed tightly against my chest. The building sat downtown near the courthouse, the same brick office Robert used to visit every spring when reviewing taxes and trust paperwork. Walking through those glass doors without him beside me felt strange, like entering a life I no longer fully recognized. Charles greeted me personally in the lobby. At 78, he moved slower now, but his sharp blue eyes missed very little. The moment he saw the folder in my hands, his expression changed quietly. You found Robert's documents, he said softly. I nodded. Inside his office, sunlight filtered weakly through tall windows overlooking the snowy streets below. Framed photographs of Charles fishing with Robert decades ago still sat on the shelves beside thick legal books. For a few moments neither of us spoke. Then Charles removed his glasses carefully and folded his hands on the desk. Your husband loved you very much, Evelyn, he said. Enough to worry what would happen after he was gone. He spent nearly an hour walking me through the trust documents piece by piece. The cabin. Several investment accounts. The land beneath Daniel's current home. Robert had protected nearly everything through conditional inheritance clauses tied directly to family conduct and shared stewardship. If I was intentionally isolated, displaced from family property, pressured into assisted living against my wishes, or manipulated out of ownership decisions, the trust automatically froze all transfers and sales pending trustee review. Monica and Daniel could not legally sell the cabin. Worse for them, attempting to pressure me into surrendering rights could permanently reduce their inheritance share. I sat there stunned by how carefully Robert anticipated every possibility. Charles sighed quietly before opening another file from his desk drawer. There is more you should know. Inside were copies of emails between Monica and a real estate consultant dated almost 9 months earlier. Discussions about listing timelines, renovation estimates, market projections for transitioning elderly ownership assets. My stomach tightened reading those words. Elderly ownership assets. Not Robert's cabin. Not family history. Not memories. Assets. Charles watched me carefully. I debated telling you sooner, he admitted. But Robert believed you deserved the chance to see people clearly for yourself. By afternoon, snow had begun falling steadily outside the office windows. Before leaving, I asked Charles one question that had haunted me for weeks. Did Daniel know? Charles was quiet for a long moment. At first, I do not think so, he answered honestly. But over time he stopped asking questions he should have asked. The drive home felt strangely calm. Not happy. Not triumphant. Just clear. For years I kept shrinking myself to preserve peace inside a family already pushing me toward the edges. Now I finally understood something important. Silence only protects the people benefiting from it. That evening my phone rang 3 separate times. Daniel first. Then Monica. Then Daniel again. I let every call go to voicemail. Around 8:30 Sophie texted me instead. Mom is furious. Dad looks terrified. I stared at the message for several seconds before setting the phone. Face down beside my teacup. Outside, snow covered the neighborhood in soft white silence while Christmas lights glowed warmly along nearby rooftops. For the first time since Robert died, the quiet inside my house no longer felt empty. It felt steady. Safe even. Near midnight another voicemail arrived from Monica. Her voice sounded tight beneath forced politeness. Evelyn, I think there has been some misunderstanding regarding the cabin and family finances. We should talk before things become unnecessarily complicated. I listened to the message twice before deleting it calmly. Then I walked to the hallway closet and pulled out Robert's old winter coat. In the pocket, exactly where he always kept it, rested a small flashlight wrapped in red tape so he could find it easily in the dark. I held it in my hand for a long moment and suddenly smiled through quiet tears. Robert spent his whole life preparing for storms before anyone else noticed clouds gathering. And somehow, even after death, he was still lighting the way ahead of me. 2 weeks later, the first heavy snowstorm of December rolled across Colorado, covering rooftops and pine trees beneath thick white silence. I spent that morning at the cabin alone. A fire crackled softly inside the stone fireplace while cedar smoke drifted faintly through the cold air. For the first time in years, the cabin felt peaceful again instead of haunted by tension and avoidance. I wore one of Robert's old flannel shirts over my sweater, while organizing family photographs into albums I had neglected since his death. Some pictures made me smile despite everything. Daniel at age 9 missing his 2 front teeth beside a snowman near the dock. Sophie asleep in a canoe wearing a tiny yellow life jacket. Monica in the early years before ambition hardened every soft edge inside her. Around noon my phone buzzed. Daniel's name appeared on the screen again. This time I answered. His voice sounded exhausted. Older somehow. Mom, can we come by? He asked quietly. I looked out the cabin window toward the frozen lake before answering. You already know where I am. They arrived an hour later. Monica stepped carefully through the snow in. Expensive leather boots clearly unsuited for mountain weather while Daniel carried a bakery box awkwardly beneath one arm. Peace offerings. Appearances. Habits learned too late. Sophie followed behind them quietly, her cheeks pink from the cold. The moment they entered the cabin, something shifted in Daniel's expression. He looked around slowly at the photographs, the fishing poles, the old quilt folded beside the couch. I think for the first time in years he truly saw the place instead of its market value. Monica remained standing near the doorway clutching her gloves too tightly. Evelyn, she began carefully, we really think this entire situation has been blown out of proportion. I poured coffee calmly into 4 mugs before answering. Interesting, I said softly, because I spent years believing the same thing every time I was humiliated. Silence settled heavily through the room. Snow tapped quietly against the windows while the fire cracked behind us. Daniel stared down into his coffee cup. Monica inhaled sharply like she wanted to argue but could not find safe footing anymore. Finally Daniel spoke. Mom, I should have stopped this a long time ago. His voice cracked slightly on the final words. I looked at my son carefully then. Really looked at him. The tired eyes. The guilt. The years spent avoiding discomfort because confronting cruelty required courage he did not have. Yes, I replied gently. You should have. Monica's face tightened immediately. I never intended to hurt you, she insisted quickly. We were only trying to make practical decisions about the future. Practical. That word again. Everything cruel became practical eventually when people stopped seeing you as human. I reached beside the fireplace and picked up one of Robert's old photo albums before placing it quietly on the coffee table. Inside were decades of summers at the cabin, birthday cakes, fishing trips, Christmas mornings. Sophie learning to skate on the frozen lake. Your husband built this place for family, I said softly. Not transactions. Not convenience. Family. Monica lowered her eyes for the first time since I had known her. Not out of shame entirely. More because control had finally slipped beyond her reach. Sophie moved beside me on the couch and rested her head lightly against my shoulder the same way she did as a little girl after nightmares. Outside, snow continued falling steadily across the frozen lake, while evening settled over the mountains. Daniel looked toward the old pencil marks still lining the hallway wall downstairs, and suddenly began crying quietly into his hands. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the exhausted grief of someone finally realizing how much he traded away piece by piece without noticing, until almost nothing meaningful remained. I sat beside the fire listening to the storm outside and understood something Robert had tried teaching me for years. Love is not proven by how much pain you can quietly survive for others. Sometimes love means refusing to disappear just because it makes everyone else more comfortable if you do. And as the cabin filled once more with the sounds of a family finally forced to face itself honestly, I realized they had never removed my place from the table after all. They had only forgotten who built the home around it.